Welcome back to Aether Hour, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitriy Kalyagin here with another supporter Q&A. That's right, we are answering questions from our beloved Aether Hour paywall supporters over on the World War Now Substack. And if you want to join the ranks of, this Aether Hour army, you can support us at worldwarnow.co, get behind that paywall, just $7 a month. And on the next Q&A, we can answer your questions. We answer questions about everything, really. I mean, there's only a few topics we may decide to not answer on air. And even if we don't answer it on air, we will try to send you a message via text or answer it in the Substack thread. So don't hesitate to ask whatever you want, get behind that paywall, support the show. And you also, of course, get access to all the hundreds and hundreds of hours of other Aether Hour content, interviews with Father Peter Heers, Father John Whiteford, Abbot Trefon, all sorts of other amazing guests, Cameron McGregor, Vince James, Gregory Heers. There's so much great content behind that paywall. And of course, everything we do here is only possible because of our wonderful supporters. So keep us both in your prayers. And if you want to support the show, please do. And we would love to hear from you on the next Q&A. But with all of that, I think we got some questions to dive right into. Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing amazing, Conrad. And the first question from Silouan. Every World War Now episode, I look forward to hearing Dmitry say, "Doing great, Conrad." But Conrad, how are you doing?
Oh, what a great question. Thank you, Silouan. I'm doing well. Dmitry, why don't you ever ask me this question?
Well, I'm kind of assuming you're doing well, and then we jump right into the news. Yeah.
Of course, yes. That's for those that aren't already aware. Dmitry and I probably spend at least 2 hours talking before the episode starts recording. Mm-hmm. So he's very much aware that I am not in dire straits. He's not just, who cares? Let's get into the news. Which, that being said, sometimes that's how it feels. We hop on the call and there's so much going on. I mean, I remember the week of October 7th, we were going to record and we were like, let's wait a few hours to record. And boy, were we correct. We just were like, what's going on here? But there's always so much news to talk about. So, Dmitry knows that when I hand it over to him, we got to dive right in because we're in that headspace. So that's what we've got going on. But I appreciate you asking, Silouan. I'm doing well. Keep me in your prayers. And we're praying for you guys as well. We try to remember the supporters, especially when you ask a question. I try to keep you guys in my prayers as well. So thanks for the question. But good question here from Rus Ortho. In light of the recent reset in Russian and American relations, are there any signs that the U.S. administration will bring any relief to the long-suffering Serbian people under occupation? A place to start might be to end the persecution of Dodik. While on the topic of Serbia, is the recent vote in the UN supporting the EU position on Ukraine incompetency, as was stated, or just weak leadership? Good questions about Serbia. Obviously, we did talk about the Dodik situation a bit in the World War Now episode, at least I did, with GSP and Isaac. But, things continue to develop there. Ultimately, things don't get too dramatic because Bosnia and Herzegovina is a very weak country. They're not able to actually bring Dodik to quote unquote justice as they want to. And, Vucic, despite, us calling him the cuck of Kosovo, he did not hesitate to immediately go and meet with Dodik, which was great to see. However, we have also discussed that unfortunately, one of the reasons Dodik is allowed to move as laterally as he is because he is a supporter of Israel. So the establishment doesn't view him perhaps as dangerous as certain other characters. But I agree. I mean, the U.S. had that flyover over Sarajevo with those jets and those bombers in support of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I do believe that the Trump administration is much more likely to really support the Serbs in this situation, hop off the situation in Kosovo, hop off the situation in Srpska. But I don't exactly know of any immediate plans for that. I do know that there are some developing American Orthodox lobbies kind of in the works. And I know a lot of Serbs are involved in that. So I hope that, I know Rick Grinnell, for being a homosexual neocon in many capacities, I wouldn't say he was necessarily a supporter of the Serbs, but he wasn't a hardcore Kosovo, Bosnian nationalist, Albanian nationalist per se. So I think a lot of things could happen. I don't know exactly if there are immediate plans for there to be a referendum. Again, I haven't seen, if the Bosnians do something crazy, I could see Dodik escalating that. And again, we don't even know if the referendum would then be followed by another referendum to rejoin Serbia, if Serbia would just, quote unquote, annex them and just kind of take down the border. Or again, there's all sorts of things could happen. A lot of it does depend on, how the U.S. and, the Marco Rubio State Department decide to handle it. And I think, perhaps the Russians, if they start to get more and more of their demands on the Ukrainian front, maybe they could also ask for some relief from their fellow Slavs. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on this situation, Dmitry.
Yeah, I think the Serbian question at the moment is very complicated because I agree with you, Conrad. Vucic is a very shifty character, right? Even the Serbians themselves, especially patriotic right-wing Serbians, don't necessarily trust him. And we know the Serbian people, at least in Belgrade itself and the White City, they're very prone to protest, as we saw in late 2024, early 25. So we just have to consider what are the options available for Serbia. It appears that in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Republika Srpska, Dodik is very much representative of the average Serbian person living in this majority Muslim country. And so, of course, with the weakness of that state, there's a high chance that perhaps if there are any concessions given to Serbia, it will be in Bosnia and Herzegovina as opposed to in Kosovo and Metohija. But both of these particular places are of great interest to the Serbian people. And until, of course, Serbia is reunited with both Kosovo and Metohija as well as Republika Srpska and arguably certain parts of Croatia as well, but we're not going to get into that discussion here. The Serbian geopolitical quest and sort of for Serbian totality and holistically speaking for the Serbian people will not be completed. And of course, Montenegro as well. So I think Bosnia-Herzegovina, Republika Srpska, this will be the first piece of the puzzle that will perhaps, especially if Trump chooses to give these concessions to the Serbian people, maybe if they distance themselves from Russia and move close to the EU, perhaps this will be granted as a gift of goodwill. And I think the Serbian people, as long as they don't compromise on culture and in particular don't liberalize themselves any further, become more neoliberal, more degenerate, I think it's potentially something that they may take. And not just Vučić, but I think generally the Serbian people will probably accept that gift of goodwill as opposed to heightening the situation and making things a bit more complicated, especially with how inconsistent Russian foreign policy has been recently, in particular in Syria. So I think the Serbian people need to look out for themselves first and foremost and not really depend on even perhaps their Slavic brothers at this point too much. As painful as that may be, I think, to the Slavic ears to hear, it's just at the moment it's a very complicated situation and the war in Ukraine continues to rage on. And this next question, of course, from Stefan. Very interesting question here indeed. You mentioned something in a recent episode about Chernobyl possibly being sabotaged by the usual subjects. I would like to know more about that. Well, I suppose I'll just begin answering this question, Conrad. Essentially what we have here, Stefan, is Chernobyl, historically speaking, going back to the 1500s to Rzeczpospolita, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, of course, the most philo-Semitic pro-Jewish state, essentially in medieval Renaissance Europe, despite the fact that it was majority Roman Catholic and it had a sizable Orthodox Christian population, was still very friendly to these people. And when this Commonwealth occupied the lands just north of Kiev, 85 kilometers away from Kiev in Pripyat, Chernobyl, there was a large Ashkenazi Jewish settlement located in Chernobyl. In fact, until the Second World War, and arguably just, it was reduced slightly during the Russian Civil War, 3/4 or so of the population of Chernobyl was in fact Jewish. There's an entire dynasty of rabbis and a few actually big rabbinical families that go back to Chernobyl. There's a lot of controversial figures whose family members possibly come from Chernobyl. For example, the late Alexei Navalny's father actually was born around this area. So a very sort of mysterious place, I would say. And what makes this area even more interesting is that in the 1600s, there was a really large series of pogroms, essentially real pogroms, and we mean proper raids, skirmishes committed by Bogdan Khmelnytsky during his wars for essentially Zaporozhian Cossack independence and unity with Russia against the Commonwealth of Poland and Lithuania. Especially he was fighting against essentially rich, usurious Jewish oligarchs in the area. And he, allegedly committed something akin to a 1600s Holocaust in this particular part of the world. So the memory of the local Ashkenazis is very much contingent on the fact that they remember Russian pogroms very well. Now, the Chernobyl disaster in 1986, it happened on the 26th of April. Funny enough, this year, 25th of April will be Easter, but notice the date. It actually took place on the third day of Jewish Passover, or the second day of Passover, happened in that Passover Pesach period. As we know, just like with Crocus City Hall, which took place on the eve of Purim, a lot of these so-called natural or accidental man-made disasters do take place, just like Shavuot in June as well. A lot of these disasters take place in proximity, and they're somewhat contingent on the Talmudic calendar, which I think is very curious. And we just have to look at sort of the names as well of the people involved. A lot of the physicists and nuclear engineers and essentially very smart professors and scientists involved in the nuclear industry in the late USSR were in fact of this particular group as well. We just have to mention Nikolai Steinberg, for example, the colleague of George Kopczynski. And Kopczynski was the man in charge, essentially, of the disaster itself. If you recall in the Chernobyl TV show, the man of the mustache, right, Dyatlov, was essentially blamed for the entire thing. But Dyatlov, when he was calling the Ukrainian main station, in relation to what he should do with the Chernobyl experiment, when the disaster was taking place in front of him, the phone was being answered by this George Kopczynski character. Now, Kopczynski, his colleague, was literally Nicholas Steinberg. I don't really need to describe the ethnicity here. But there was other characters, of course, involved, which their origin, sort of ethnically speaking, brings to mind, for example, like Marlen Moiseyevich Karliner, right? He's one of the main Novosibirsk nuclear engineers that actually designed the Chernobyl plans, to have that test even take place, the test that led to the disaster. The head of the nuclear industry in the late USSR, Yefim Slavsky, again, sort of questionable ethnic origins. And so we have a few of these people that I would say, Vadim Ausländer as well, definitely kind of Baltic last name, not very Russian. There's people of very dubious ethnicity involved here. But more than likely, you'll hear anecdotes from Russians, and I'm going to quote Nicholas Bandarik here as well as Dmitry Khalezov, two very right-wing Russians. They both swear on the fact that, especially in the early 90s, when Russia was undergoing a lot of change, it wasn't that far away from 1986. They openly claimed that in Moscow and St. Petersburg, in a lot of political circles, there was a lot of rumors that people of Germanic or Ashkenazi sort of Jewish last names, Berg, Stein, etc., were warned ahead of time to leave Chernobyl, right, ahead of time. And many people, because Chernobyl is not that far from, less than 100 kilometers away from Kiev, many of these people even left Kiev just in case ahead of time. And so what we saw was essentially rumors, a lot of anecdotal evidence, especially from right-wing Russians, that in fact this was some sort of either a faulty experiment to begin with, or perhaps a massive ritual sacrifice of some sort, or even a FSB KGB diversion. The reason I mention the KGB here as well is because clearly, just like the main character in the Chernobyl TV show, which I think people should watch because it really does pass on this atmosphere of confusion and the spiritual grayness, despite the fact that it is HBO, right? The spiritual grayness of the late USSR period, right? That sort of deep atheism and the state that it put the Russian people sort of into, of course, which caused the collapse of the 90s. Legasov, right, the main character, he allegedly commits suicide, right, at the end of the, spoiler alert, as per history. But Legasov, I believe, most likely was assassinated because he had clear knowledge as to what exactly happened on the Chernobyl plant in 1986. So he was most likely a good Russian hero who paid the price for being associated with this industry. And the best proof that this industry, the nuclear industry in the USSR, was so corrupt is in the early 1980s, just before the Chernobyl power plant. A lot of these scientists, by the way, were from Novosibirsk, that particular city, sort of in Siberia. You'll note that there was a big parade held in Novosibirsk. The clips, we actually have them on our Telegram. If you search up Chernobyl, for example, the scientists and nuclear physicists, they kept having these parades where they celebrated witchcraft, Satanism, in like a mockery type fashion. They were having these essential processions dressed as demons, devils, etc. So it's all very, I think, mysterious. And the Chernobyl disaster definitely was not just an accident of some professionals who simply pressed the wrong buttons. There is more to this particular story. Unfortunately, not many sources really cover it. And if you publish anything on this subject in the Eastern Europe, you may actually catch a case for anti-Semitism and hate speech. So at the moment, we don't really have all the resources to really investigate this in depth. But definitely this accident that took place, this tragedy on Jewish Passover was not some simple event that can be reduced to just human error, in my opinion.
I think there's a lot of interesting stuff there. And I think to go even deeper, again, I'm no expert on this. People that have been watching the show for a while will know that I've got a more unorthodox opinion on the nuclear issue. But on one level, I mean, this is like the closest thing we have to alchemy at a certain level. I mean, I watched Oppenheimer semi-recently, and, besides being extremely Jewish and, being a bit of a model and display of Cillian Murphy just kind of looking constipated all the time, you can tell how, how almost religious the whole nuclear atomic age thing has been. And of course, I've discussed the importance of mutually assured destruction as a geopolitical psychological concept as probably being more powerful than the damage of a supposed nuclear atomic bomb itself. I'm skeptical of the amount of radiation that lingers, and this actually, this is getting a bit schizophrenic, but this comports with a lot of the prophecies. Metropolitan Iofitos himself has talked about how there will be like huge nukes falling on Constantinople and on other places in the midst of the Third World War when the Russians attack the Turks. But he says that due to some miracle or due to what will happen, there will be no radiation that will damage the earth. And I think you can interpret that in a few ways. One that, perhaps obviously they just been lying to us about all of this. And it's, but the people that deployed them didn't even necessarily know how much, the radiation would dissipate and not linger. Or, again, there will also be other miracles that will prevent the wholesale destruction of a lot of the world and a lot of, the center of the world island, as it were. But if people want to look into more of the more conspiratorial scientific side of this stuff, you can look up Galen Windsor, former nuclear head of science for General Electric in the 20th century. He talks a lot about how Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, he didn't talk about this, but people have then tied in Fukushima, the disaster in Japan, into, again, I'm forgetting all of the details, but it's sort of a range between whether they were intentionally, ignored and then allowed to happen and then hyped up in the media, or straight up, false flag events that were orchestrated in some capacity. But the general idea being that they were to scare the world away from nuclear energy, have people convinced that there are all these huge exclusion zones that now exist, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, where, you can't go and the whole world could become like that, except there's people that never left the Chernobyl exclusion zone. You can go to Fukushima now, it's totally fine. And, there's animals that, in fact, there's so many animals there now, because of course a lot of people did get evacuated because of the public perception and response, but now it's like a thriving, almost nature wilderness area. And there's no three-headed pigs like some Vice documentaries from 2013 would try to convince you of. But yeah, I think, Galen Windsor, he would go around and eat enriched uranium and plutonium in front of audiences. And he lived to be like 88 years old and died of Parkinson's or something like that. So interesting character. And I think there's a lot of, between the more alchemical side of things, there's still, I think, a dangerous element to it. But on the other hand, I think there's also a lot of deception, from a basic level, probably from the fossil fuel industry, as well as from, the people that pull the levers on geopolitics and international relations to keep the perception of mutually assured destruction, nuclearized states having the ability to do all of this. So they therefore have to do all the negotiating. I mean, that's sort of the purpose of the UN Security Council, is it's like, well, we can't have little petty wars anymore, because at the end of the day, these 6, 7, 8 countries have nuclear weapons. So they ultimately, through great power politics in some capacity, get to make the calls, which, that's how that goes. There's also, of course, the reality that they don't want countries becoming energy independent from the petrodollar, these other things, by developing their own nuclear energy. However, this new revolution, this mini nuclear reactor revolution we're hearing about, we're hearing about the deployment of hundreds of nuclear reactors, mini nuclear reactors in the United States next to all these huge data centers, that are going to be used for this AI revolution. So I think ultimately the taboo on mass nuclear is probably going to go away, and we'll probably see some of this scalable mini reactor technology hitting some of these other countries. But I guess I'm curious how that will disrupt any kind of energy politics in the future. Maybe we'll ask George McMillan or somebody else a question about that. But we have another question here from Michael, who says, an overview of the Caucasus and the people who live there. Specifically, I would like to understand the relationship that Russia has to the Muslims, to Georgia, and to Armenia. A separate deep dive into Georgia and Ossetia would also be interesting. I'm increasingly fascinated by this region. If it is outside of your interest or purview for a whole episode, perhaps you or someone here can suggest further reading. Even in Russia, it is exceedingly difficult to find material on Ossetia, for example. Well, Ossetia is interesting. I do know they have a big problem with a sort of, I don't want to say a cult, but they sort of have a heresy there where they believe that St. George is sort of part of the Trinity, or St. George is sort of like equal to Jesus or God or something like that. And a lot of people believe this there, and it's sort of like a folk pagan-y kind of adaptation. But besides that, obviously, I think the situation with Georgia, we've talked about it on the show a few times in the past about how ultimately the Russian Empire was not, quote unquote, genocidally Russifying Georgia. In reality, the Georgian birth rate recovered under the Russian Empire. And ultimately, again, at this point, I don't think there's any danger of Russia, quote unquote, annexing Georgia, but existing solidly within the Russian sphere of influence, I think, is obviously to the benefit of Georgia. And ultimately, the Georgian Dream Party understands this while still being firmly Georgian nationalist and wanting to reclaim South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Now, regarding Armenia, they continue to shrink. We've talked about the prophecies that talk about how when the war with Turkey comes to pass, there will be a Kurdish state, and Armenia will greatly increase, which Based on what's occurring right now on the show, I've gamed out a few situations where that is very likely to occur. But what are your thoughts on this broad Caucasus question, Dmitry?
I think a good introduction, Michael, and I'm sure you've already read these particular articles, but our publication and translations of Nicholas Kozlov's Ritual War, I think it is a really good and esoteric deep dive into the Caucasus, into the war of the 1990s. And it sort of gives a really look at the mysteries behind this particular place, some of the perhaps unspoken truths, especially in relation to the Mountain Jews and all these other small ethnicities. But what you'll notice, the general theme of the Caucasus, of course, notwithstanding Georgia in particular, this very large homogeneous ethnos, which is deeply Orthodox Christian since the time of St. Constantine the Great and St. Nina, equal to the apostles, is you'll notice that all of these, especially Dagestan is like a great example. The Caucasus Mountains are like the breaking place of waves of many nomadic empires. So you'll see there's the Nagaitse, the Lezgin, Dargin people, Kubachin, Kalmyks, Azeris, people related to the Shia Persians, the Sassanids. You have people of Turkic ethnicity, and they're all intermixed. It's essentially a cauldron, a melting pot of various ancient empires, even ancient Khazarians as well. So you'll see how essentially once these empires reach the Caucasus, they either break or perhaps the leftovers of these ancient empires create little settlements and villages, which is why you have these very homogeneous little cells and fragments of these ancient peoples. Essentially, it's like a petri dish of genetics located in the Caucasus, and they're all very much divided. Of course, the largest, most homogeneous ethnos north of the Caucasus are not the Georgians or the Ossetians, it's in fact the Chechens. Probably, and they're very homogeneous. In fact, probably one of the most homogeneous people, despite this, besides, of course, various tribes like Native Americans, like highly inbred in like a very basic sort of scientific fashion, shall we say. But there are, of course, the complexity, of course, with the Muslims does come from the fact that in a lot of these cultures, they are very, and if I may speak from a very white perspective, they are very barbaric in terms of they have a culture of raiding each other, stealing wives. Ritual war, in a way, is like very common amongst these people. Blood feuds, skirmishes, duels, these are things which are very common to these regions. And thievery, robbery, theft is found to be quite common. I think a really good historical snapshot, Michael, that you can look at, in particular in how Russia historically related to the Caucasus Mountains, besides, of course, Russia's relationship with the Georgians, and of course the Georgian evangelism of Ossetia. And notice Conrad mentioned the fact that St. George is highly venerated, and that's because, of course, St. Nina of Georgia was maybe related to St. George the Great Martyr as well. Part of her life is that she was apparently his first cousin, right? So that's very interesting. And she, essentially, the Georgians were some of the first people who evangelized Ossetia, and Ossetia, just after the fall of the Khazaria, was this quite interesting mountainous kingdom of Alania for some time until the Mongol conquest completely destroyed it. So Ossetia did have some sort of Christian independence. It could have formed into its own little Georgia, perhaps, like a little project, but it never really survived the sort of those late high middle age period just before the Renaissance, and it was kind of destroyed. And this is why Ossetians today are very much like a remnant of an ancient Christian people that simply didn't really make it out of the cradle, you can almost say. But I would also add, of course, the one event which I mentioned would be the 1552 siege of Kazan by Ivan Grozny. And in fact, you'll note that almost half of the huge army that Ivan Grozny put together, it's over 150,000 people, wasn't entirely ethnically Russian. In fact, more than half of the compatriots that the Tsar put together into this massive army to take on the Kazan Khanate was the locals of the Northern Caucasus. A lot of these small Orthodox princes, knyazya, etc., some of which came from these particular Northern Caucasus areas. And I would just say that Islam in these particular places is very deeply Sufi, Sunni, and it's very spiritual, mystical, probably quite far away from Salafism and Wahhabism because it's not a very sort of pure Islam from that perspective. But it's a very interesting region, and it really is very, very diverse. I mean, Dagestan is like probably the best example of that. That's the land, of course, located with Derbent, Makhachkala, of course, Petrovsk port. Makhachkala was renamed to this, whatever this Makhachkala even means, during the Soviet period. So a lot of these places are very interesting. Maybe one day we'll have an expert on who of course specializes in the Northern Caucasus. And we just have to mention, of course, that relationship between Armenia and Georgia, right, Conrad? It's so weird because Armenia and Georgia, these two Christian peoples, live side by side, yet there's almost no communication between them because the Armenians are non-Chalcedonian monophysites, and you have the Georgians who are very strongly Orthodox Christians. So you can see even that religious divide amongst the Christians in the Caucasus and the Southern Caucasus, it does create this sort of division between people. So these are very archaic, very culturally, shall we say, based Bronze Age type of tribes that live in these areas, which make it, I think, very fascinating for the modern people who are so invested in this sort of Western culture. And unfortunately, we're raised in it. This place is very distant. It's almost like you jump into a time machine and you go back to the age of Conan the Barbarian, who himself was a Cimmerian. And the Cimmerian people, they come from this area just on the northern shores of the Black Sea. So it's a very ancient and very, I would say, mystical, mysterious place. And the next question from Nicholas Holt. Hello, Dmitry and Conrad. I hope all is well. I have a question. Have the two of you ever heard of Utahnism? And what do you think we as Orthodox could use the Orthodox Christian Coalition, perhaps an American Orthodox Christian political coalition, to push Utahnism forward so that in the future we can better reforge America in accordance with the will of God? It's certainly a movement, although in its infancy, worth checking out. So, Conrad, perhaps you could enlighten me as to what is Utahnism and what are the prospects of this particular political movement in the future of America?
Yeah, I mean, I visited the website for Utahnism and learned more about that specific project. I was able to surmise what it means without having to look it up, and I assumed that when I read this, that it means a sort of identitarian state solution where people move to certain states around a certain religious or political identity and then encourage others to move there. And then eventually that state becomes sort of a de facto place for those people to live. Obviously, Utah being the example because it was started by Mormons to have a Mormon state. And even though obviously we have total pluralism now in America, it still in its remnant form very much exists. The governor of Utah is never not going to be a Mormon. Most of the senators are going to be Mormons, if not Mormon appearing evangelicals. And not only is the governor going to be Mormon, he's also going to be the person endorsed by the Mormon prophet, who is, sort of the Mormon Pope, the head of the Mormon religion. And I think, yeah, I've always kind of agreed with this. I looked it up, of course, and it's sort of a more specific movement towards actually redrawing the states and having them be around more specific identities and whatnot, and allowing localists, and local governments to have more sovereignty and whatnot, which, I'm all about. However, from an Orthodox perspective, I have encouraged Orthodox people to move to specific places. Obviously, Orthodoxy right now, very urban religion in certain capacities. There is a lot of growing rural communities, especially around monasteries, especially the monasteries of Elder Ephraim. But generally speaking, most of our parishes are in urban or suburban communities. And obviously, if we were to start with the numbers, the two obvious choices for states are Pennsylvania and Alaska, which have 6% and 5% of the population already being Orthodox, respectively. But look, I don't want to move to Alaska. Sorry, Alaska heads. I want to visit. Maybe I'd even spend some extended periods of time there. But I'm Pacific Northwest pilled, but unfortunately, I'm not Alaska pilled. I enjoy the sun too much. I enjoy other things. I don't know. Alaska kind of frightens me sometimes. I'd still love to visit. But Pennsylvania also, you're never going to, unless the state splits up, you're never going to actually take over Pennsylvania. You've got, Philadelphia, the whole situation going on over there. So I've always encouraged people. I do believe that West Virginia, Idaho, potentially even Kentucky and certain other places, Arkansas even, I believe these are states that if people can actually, if people with money can set up intentional communities and build institutions that would attract Orthodox people en masse, I believe that could lead to some fruitful endeavors. I think even at the county level, people should be thinking about that, what counties we could take over to where, Orthodox people serve on the county commission. We have Orthodox people as the sheriff, the county sheriff, mayors, these sorts of things. I think that's very important. And unfortunately for us to take over an entire state, we're going to have to see a lot more mass conversions, but I do believe that we will get there. And I think that there are prophecies that phase all of that out. But yeah, that was a good question, Nicholas. Again, Utah, I mean, maybe a lot of Mormons will convert to Orthodoxy. I do foresee Mormon collapse at some point in the nearest future because it is not sustainable. And the Mormon establishment, I mean, look, they cucked on saying black people are humans a while ago. Look, obviously, I agree that black people are humans and go to heaven and all of that. Mormons, took them a while. But look, if that was, the revelation, then they just changed it. What does that say? They cucked on polygamy, obviously, some of these things that they're very famous for. How long till they just completely abandon the remnant social conservatism they already have? I mean, there are already a lot of problems with prescription drug use and others within the Mormon community, but I still think they're good white Anglos, so we got to pray for them. And I don't rejoice at the demise of, traditional Mormonism, but at the same time, it is a heretical cult. and if it gives them the opportunity to find the truth as opposed to descending into degeneracy, which unfortunately is often the case. A lot of ex-Mormons are, I mean, you've seen the worst ex-evangelicals or, ex-religious people. Imagine them like times 10 when you meet these ex-Mormons. So it's really a terrible, side of each coin, Mormonism or, the anti-Mormonism. It's both pretty terrible, but hopefully they can find orthodoxy as well. But yeah, I think if people want to look up Utahism, you go to utahism.org. It explains more things, nothing super surprising per se. I don't think this movement is, I don't know who's behind this movement. I don't know if they're necessarily going to go anywhere. Their symbol is like an octopus or something. So a little bit goofy, but the general idea behind it, I think, is just it's a socio-political trend that is undoubtedly occurring right now. And the question is, will the federal government perhaps support this in some capacity, or will there come a time when the federal government cracks down on something like this and there is, there's tension that does result in either a suspension of states' rights, which I think has already reached pretty far. The states don't have that much power ever since, I mean, not just the Civil War, but ever since especially the Civil Rights Act of the 1960s, which pretty much destroyed freedom of association in this country. But yeah, I think this is important. And I mean, I'm in Central Texas, which again, Texas itself, enormous state, a lot of diversity problems, a lot of cultural problems, especially in the cities. But where I'm at in Central Texas, Orthodoxy is exploding. I mean, every single parish in the area, of which, if you take the general metro area, there's 8, 9 parishes, maybe a little more, plus a monastery. Every place has 40 plus catechumens, including the tiny little missions. And the bigger churches have 90, 100, 110 plus catechumens at this point. So it's very real. And I think this type of solution is very much viable. But we got to move on here. Question from Silwan. Dearest brothers, thank you and may God bless you all your efforts and struggles. Thank you. God bless you as well, brother. He says, I'm wondering if you might comment on the potent propaganda machine in Canada. As we see here, a rather hilarious burst of so-called Canadian nationalism being sprouted from the very people who were very eager to freeze the bank accounts of those who dared to protest the COVID lockdowns and mandatory vaccinations. The worst part is, it seems like my dear Canadian brothers and sisters are quickly buying into it all, as if we can actually unite a Masonically forged experimental nation on Canadian products alone. Notwithstanding our exuberant funding of Ukraine, as we are obviously deep in the Zagosphere. Do you have any thoughts on Canada in this regard? Thank you and God bless. Yeah, man, Canada's cooked, bro. I don't know what to tell you guys. It's pretty much just over. Especially, I mean, as much as I love, as an American, Trump dunking on Canada, because Canada's a meme, and I grew up with a lot of Canadians, so it's funny, but it's not helping you guys as much as I hate to admit, because y'all were headed towards a historic defeat for the Labour Party. They were going to get kicked to the curb, almost like the Conservatives in the UK did recently in their huge, enormous defeat. But unfortunately, Trump's anti-Canadian American nationalist bluster has totally revamped Trudeau. I think Trudeau probably wishes that he didn't step down, because obviously Trudeau isn't going to be standing in the next election against Pierre Poilievre, leader of the Conservative Party in Canada. But I think he probably wishes he did now, because there's a chance that maybe they'll still lose, but it will not be some huge defeat. And as much as it's good that they'll lose, the Conservatives are no different. They're every single campaign rally, Poilievre is meeting with Sikhs and other brown people to convince everyone he's not a racist. There's no indication that they're going to dramatically slow immigration. They're kind of talking about it. So I've always said the future of Canada is balkanization. I mean, Canadian nationalism is a meme. It's like inherently libtarded. It's like over 50% of the energy behind Canadian nationalism is literally just anti-Americanism, and Canadian anti-Americanism is literally just libtard leftism, like anti-racism, pro-sodomy nonsense, anti-Christianity. So despite all of that, there are a lot of white conservative Christians in Canada, and I think those people need to, I don't want to say take matters into their own hands, but I think they need to start politically organizing in a way that will lead to them being able to, honestly, like Canada, I think will be the first step in what will, again, in some way, shape, or form, unfortunately, we know it's a Club of Rome globalist plan that we've talked about, how Trump and these right-wing leaders in many ways are leading us towards a path that nationalists would never have accepted. But I think Canada will be the first state to balkanize, and then we'll have something more akin to Europe on the North American continent, with what was formerly Canada being broken up into 4, maybe 5 countries, perhaps America getting broken up into 8, 9 countries, and then who knows what happens with Mexico, right? It's already not a real functional state. So less interesting in some capacity. But as far as the propaganda goes, yeah, I mean, I don't know what I'd do if I live in Canada. Like, I don't know what you would watch. I don't know who you would go to. I mean, I know there are good priests. I mean, Father Michael, he's a Rocor priest in Canada. I know Archbishop Gabriel was the Rocor bishop there, so you had that going for you. But now he's been moved to being the temporary bishop of the Chicago Diocese of Rocor here in America. And he'll probably become the main bishop for that anyway. So I don't know what to say to you guys. Obviously, I think this tariff war that's going on right now, it's not going to end well for you. Trump has the upper hand. But, even though you guys did win the match, the hockey match, we did win that fight in the earlier match. We beat y'all pretty bad. And, Canadians booing the national anthem. I mean, people got to recognize me. The Canadian national anthem is, I'm sorry, but it's cringe and gay. The Canadian flag is cringe and gay. When y'all cucked and took out the UK, the Union Jack off your flag, it was pretty much over, but it ultimately already was over. But I mean, now it's just Jeetland over there too. So as much as I think as Americans, I think not just Canada becoming a bunch of different countries, but I think Alberta and Saskatchewan could probably join the United States, become either the 51st state or the 51st and the 52nd state. And honestly, I'd be down to extend that same invitation to Newfoundland and Labrador, but the rest of them, I don't want anything to do with them. And as much as I would love for Cascadia to be real, I don't need all those Chinese people that live in Vancouver to become American citizens either. So British Columbia, Ontario, Manitoba, maybe it can go either way. We don't want anything to do with those. Those can stay their own little thing. And then the Quebecois, they would never want to join America. They would obviously become their own thing as well. And then, the Nova Scotians, whatever, kind of indifferent. But yeah, I don't know if I answered your question 100%, but I do think that ardent Canadian nationalism is ironically what's giving the Liberal Party this sort of huge boon right now against the Conservatives. And I think it's really bad. But again, I think if Trump can do something that can accelerate the end of just Canada as an entity, I'm all for it.
Absolutely. I think the future of Canada in relation to its balkanization, of course, may, of course, play into the hands of the Zionists in terms of certain states, of course, becoming members of the United States, which is still very much APAC, Zog dominated, which is, of course, unfortunate. But we should all pray for some discernment because, again, Canada, alongside other sort of the, I would say, more British Commonwealth nations. As we know, there are 56 Commonwealth states, many of which have actually taken a more base turn, especially in Asia. Like you have Malaysia, for example, India, I would say, even Pakistan in a very Islamic fashion, or Singapore, for example. There's a lot of Commonwealth countries, former British imperial provinces and lands, which have actually become a lot more independent over time. But Canada, Australia, New Zealand, for example, each one of these political systems and federations, countries, they're essentially dominated by this two-party divide, right? It's completely artificial, Masonic. You have a conservative party, you have a liberal party. The politics in these particular nations, in Canada in particular, it's completely Masonically dominated. And I agree with your question. There's simply no real future that one can see that will positively impact, say, Canadian Christians. So I think Christian Canadians, they should be very wary, especially men and women seeking to become involved in politics. I would just say, keep your morals in check. Do not compromise with any sort of Canadian political movements. Don't get involved in any sort of Fed-related activities in particular, and don't necessarily drop your guard because Canada, especially even the Conservatives and Liberals together, they're united on the COVID issues. So that would be my recommendation. Be very wary. And if Canada does break apart, then perhaps it is God's will. And, I would just pray maybe to St. Jose Munoz Cortez, right, the new martyr recently, who was martyred in 1997, because he did reside in Canada for a long time. And Archbishop Gabriel, fortunately, there are still good hierarchs and priest clergymen who are still related to Canada. It's just the country in and of itself, it is one of these very corrupt segments of the former British Empire, very deeply Masonic. So I don't really see this country having a positive future. So I would definitely pray for discernment. And I would be looking out for my family and my local church community first and foremost. And I wouldn't maybe expand my vision beyond maybe even the local community too much, because again, you don't want to fall into certain delusions about, well, could this nation have certain positive prospects? And it somewhat even ties into this next question on nationalism. Can you even be nationalistic? In Canada's case, I think that would be quite complex. So thank you for your very deep insight, Silouan, into Canada. In some ways, I think your question is very important, I think, for Canadians living there. But next question by Deaf Culture, and this ties right into this particular discourse of nationalism, patriotism. Deaf Culture asks, a question regarding nationalism and orthodoxy. How would you reconcile nationalism and Christianity? Many of modern American and Western converted Orthodox countersignal white survival, or whites wanting a home, a territory, and the country that is theirs and theirs alone. It's a talking point for people to dunk on Christianity because it's regarded as proof to some as weak and suicidal. I tend to reference Codriano, Traditionalist Workers' Party articles back then before it went haywire, and of course the life of Saint Stephen the Great of Romania, a saint that defied the Turks and went to war with them. What would you say to those within the church that try to impede white Orthodox Christians that want the nation? White people need a home, not just in heaven, but here on earth. And I suppose I'll just answer this in brief. Nations and ethnic groups, nationalism is a real thing. We know that the Orthodox Christian philosophers such as Dostoevsky, right, such as Aksakov, and all the other people, of course, of the Silver Age in Russia of the 1800s, right? If you remember, the motto of Orthodox Imperial Russia during its late stage period was orthodoxy, monarchy, nationalism, right? Narodnost. So, and this aligns with the Apostolic Canon 34, which is the bishops of every nation must acknowledge him who is first among them and account him as their head and do nothing of consequence without his consent, etc. So this particular first line of the Apostolic Canon, which goes back to literally the 1st century of Christianity, right, according to Orthodox Christian tradition, literally presupposes the existence of nations. And nations means nationalities also exist. Nationalism is the antithesis to hyperglobalism, which is the reality. It is the modern issue that we are dealing with today because it's big melting pot. And we all know who coined that particular term and who promotes this sort of hyper mixing in order to turn the world into this consumerist blob that will be easily controlled out of a third temple Moshiach run Jerusalem. So we understand that the future of the world, at least in the concept of these globalists and these evil people who want to drive the world into the arms of Satan, it's of course all contingent on globalism and the destruction of nationalities. And naturally, these people who counter-signal say white Americans, right, for wanting a nation that is majority white, they would never say the same thing about Georgians or Greeks or Bulgarians or even Serbians. So notice a lot of these so-called, I mean, they are Orthodox Christians, but some of them are delusional. They would never apply these particular concepts that they maybe claim about Russia or America, that, oh, being American is an idea, or being Russian is an idea. It's not a particular nation, for example. They're completely wrong, right? This can be completely rebuked by the Russian Slavophiles, of course, all the other thinkers of the 1800s in Russia, and even many saints and new martyrs who wrote very deeply about patriotism and nationalism. I think this has nothing in common with reality, and these people really need to introspectively look at the nations, in particular of Greece and Georgia, and how they resisted occupation by both Persia and Turkey in order to appreciate that, yes, nations do have a right to exist, and nationalism is simply a political movement that tries to identify and strengthen that particular nation. And yes, Codriano, who is, I think, a new martyr, definitely is a part of this conversation, especially in this context of the last 100 years, because it hasn't even been 100 years since Codriano has been around in Romania. And so I think the people that counter-signal it, Conrad, you'd probably agree with me, they're just simply uneducated on the question, and they react and they essentially subscribe to these presuppositions, which are technically not even Orthodox Christian. They're liberal, and they come out of this melting pot, modern, maybe Western and neoliberal view of what the world should look like in the 21st century and onwards.
No, I completely agree. And I think it's a really complex and frankly demonic situation we've gotten ourselves into, because I view this whole mindset, this sort of, I call it like white denialism, I guess, where people vehemently deny the existence of something like the white race. They insist that despite the fact that everybody understands why a Russian is more similar to an Anglo-Saxon than an Anglo-Saxon is to a mestizo, people want to, pretend that that's not so. And the only reason they believe that, ironically, is because Americanism, the idea of America as a propositional nation, immediately usurped and became kind of the ethos that everybody should emulate in the post-war consensus, to the point where even ethno-nations like England, Germany, France have almost adopted this for themselves. And it hasn't taken as much root because fundamentally they never had as large of a black population, and they also still have much smaller immigrant populations due to the fact that they don't have land borders with non-white states like Mexico and South America. But the situation has become untenable because fundamentally America was at one point a white nationalist or quote unquote white supremacist state, much like Australia, Canada, these Anglo countries that existed. I mean, Australia, of course, had the white Australia policy. America, if you read the Founding Fathers, the 1790 Immigration Act, it said, ultimately voting rights were for straight white men of good character, but also immigration was only for white people, for Europeans, and that also mostly excluded Slavs and Italians in the early days for a lot of the time. So this obviously is a part of America. And the civil rights revolution that, totally denounced what was perceived as this evil white supremacy, this evil white nationalism, which are terms, used to this day, that then created a ripple effect that basically led to the whole world denying the white race. And it becomes this thing where in the Orthodox Church, unfortunately, people say if you try to be a quote unquote white nationalists or talk about the existence of white people and preserving it is a good thing, people will say, you're an Americanist, you're a modernist, you'll hear all this kind of stuff. Even Dugan, he'll say like, this is eugenicist, British, Royal Society, modern nonsense. And this is not true. The Americanist stuff is the race denialism. Everybody around the world before any of this happened, everybody knew what a white man was. Everybody knew what an American was. And everybody knew that an American, with the exception of, the American Negro population, the slave population, that Americans were whites of Anglo-Saxon heritage with a minority of integrated non-Germanic Anglo-Saxon people. So Italians, Irish, these people, they would always kind of be on the outskirts of whiteness, as it were, but they're white and they're Americans, and those are very similar things. And again, this was, very late African-American leaders, W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, even though they disagreed on all sorts of things, they were very much still on a page that even if they wanted to lessen segregation, that it should still be sort of maintained in some capacity. And I'm not necessarily advocating for bringing that back. It just needs to be understood that there were all sorts of blacks that advocated for it as well, for people that are going to turn it into this whole thing. But yeah, there's no reason why we need to accept the dissolution of the white race. And people will say, well, the white race is this concept. It's like, look, even if you believe that the white race is a sort of quote unquote social construct, it's under attack. People can be identified as falling under that quote unquote social construct and are being attacked for it. So you need to be against that. Even if, like, I could call black people some random thing that isn't black people and start, persecuting them and calling for their annihilation. That would be wrong, even if they aren't actually the quote unquote thing that I'm calling them, which I still believe I am a white person. White people do exist. But just to steel man the argument here, there's just no argument for why we can't stand up against what is genocidal rhetoric from Jewish media, from the black population in a lot of ways when it comes to America, from even high IQ immigrant groups like Indians. And then, of course, here in Texas and in the southwestern and southeastern United States, even, you'll get a lot of this La Raza Hispanic stuff. And the moment, Trump starts talking about deportations, the anti-white stuff really comes out. So again, I understand there's a lot of boomers, there's a lot of old people. There are these clerical statements denouncing racism from these very cringy 20th century mindsets. But I do believe that all of this is going to get worked out. I've talked to a lot of very holy people that, they have the time to think about these things. And let's just say that the disciples of the saints that we know of today, most of them at least, are not anti-racists. Let's just say that. And I know of a lot of priests, even ones you might not expect, and I'm not, don't try to interpret this because I guarantee you I have not spoken about these people ever, there are people that understand this. There are bishops that understand this. And I think there will come future bishops that are going to have to write treatises on this subject because it does need to be, it's probably ironically the biggest social contagion right now that people have completely integrated into their Christian morality. They're like, they just see, oh, racism bad. I'm Christian, therefore I'm an anti-racist, without even understanding that racism is effectively a made-up propaganda word to begin with. But that's a good question, death culture. And I think while it might seem right now that the church is quote unquote occupied by a generation that's out of touch, that's how it always is. That's how everything is. And sure, we're in a bit of an acute situation right now because the boomers have held on to power much longer than they should have. And Gen X in many ways has gotten passed over. But I believe that those millennials and Generation Z that have chosen to become Orthodox clergy, if you've chosen to become Orthodox clergy, you're not falling for a lot of these other 20th century memes. So I am a bit white-pilled on this situation. I would not black pill. But similar questions, and then it brings in the prophetic angle. We've got a few different ones of these. From Matthew here, he has a few questions. Question 1, what do you think the fate of America is in the acute future according to the prophecies? We know that America will become less of a world power. Do you think this will involve many people dying? I worry because I was just married and I'm starting a family in the next 5 years. I've heard from people who say that America is going to be destroyed in war in the next 3 years. And I've heard from more optimistic people who say that America will have a smooth decline from being a world superpower. Question 2, I have struggled a lot with feeling unpatriotic towards America. I used to be a pretty hardcore conservative patriot before I took Orthodoxy seriously. But now I don't feel very patriotic. I just don't know what to be proud of. My American inheritance, individualism, Protestantism, democracy, etc., is often at odds with my Orthodox inheritance. How do you personally reconcile this? I really want to be patriotic towards my country. I'm just struggling with pessimism. So these two questions, I think, are very similarly related. And the first thing I'll tell you is you can't walk around being scared about the prophecies, man. Let's say everything does happen in the worst possible way, right? Repent, go to church, repent, be glad that God decided to take you in his time, right? If somehow you're a victim of some kind of natural disaster or war. But I don't necessarily think that's going to happen, even if a lot of the natural disasters that do occur, I think there's a very likely chance that you survive and have to keep living. And I think the purpose of all of this is, if you're listening to this stuff thinking about getting depressed, maybe you should not listen to this stuff as much, because that is very much not the purpose of this show. I think we've made it extremely clear that if you're getting mopey and whatnot about, I'm not saying you're getting mopey. I'm just saying this stuff should be encouraging you to increase your asceticism, to increase your orthodoxy, to go deeper in the things of the faith. Because I think, and maybe I haven't elucidated this idea well enough, but I believe something that's going to get us through this, and people think this sounds cultish, is people need to spend more of their time thinking about orthodox things. Like, I'm not saying you can't like sports. I'm not saying you can't like movies and TV shows. I like all of those things. I watch a lot of movies. I watch a lot of TV. Not a lot, but like I watch TV. There are shows that I like, these sorts of things. But eventually, for us to be able to divorce ourselves from the temptations of the world and what will be the mark of the beast and the Antichrist and the satanic economy that people will be participating in, is we have to look, the stories that we think about should be the lives of the saints. The events we look forward to should be church events. Hopefully in the future, the movies we watch and support will be Orthodox films and movies. The towns we live in should be Orthodox towns. And that doesn't mean that we become spurgs that can't talk to normal people and have normal conversations. But I think in many ways, becoming Orthodox, becoming enculturated in the faith, and that doesn't mean abandoning America. I'm tying this in together, is part of being Orthodox, and part of being a Christian, of course, is loving your neighbor. And we've talked about, how obviously you love your family more than you love, random other people. And part of that is the American nation. Like, look, I get that everyone goes to their Orthodox parish and they meet and they have all these fellow Americans that are converts, and you love Orthodox people. You still love those people because they're Americans, because they're Anglo-Saxons or Germanics, or at least enculturated into that society like you. And there are presuppositions that need to go. There's very much an individualistic mindset that hinders a lot of religious communities from growing. It causes a lot of people to continue in sin when they might not otherwise. Protestantism is obviously wrong and not civilizationally viable. And democracy is, effectively satanic. So I understand everything you're saying, but being Anglo-Saxon is more than that. Because we're so deracinated, people don't even understand the depth to which they are who they are. Look, I've been to a lot of places. I've spent time in Russia. I've spent time in Europe. I've spent time in Greece. And I love these people. If anything, unlike a lot of other people, especially if I learned the language, I think I would be able to survive here. But ultimately, I love being in America. I love coming home. I love talking to people in English. I love eating American food. And I love even reading about American Orthodox saints like Elder Ephraim, Father Seraphim Rose, Dmitry of Dallas, Jose Munoz, even some of these other characters. These people, sometimes not always being the most interesting or holy of the saints per se. I mean, Elder Ephraim literally was supposedly the holiest person in the 20th century. So there's really no excuse to not be interested in the American Orthodox experience, because it's just as legitimate as if you go to Mount Athos or Greece or Russia or wherever. But I just would encourage you not to, again, patriotism does not, if patriotism means supporting the government, then okay, you don't have to support the government. No, the government sucks. Like, I think we all would rather there be a monarchy in some capacity. But again, God makes these things happen. If God doesn't want there to be a monarchy, there won't be a monarchy. That's just that. And ultimately, the American nation is not a democracy or a Protestant thing. It is the stock of the people that came here. And yeah, those people were heretics, and a lot of those people believed silly things, but most of those people probably didn't even know what Orthodox Christianity was. So you shouldn't be ashamed of them. You should pray for them. Mm-hmm. And you should look at the good things that they left us, which was, an amazing country. We had some amazing cities before the Civil Rights Revolution ruined them. And there's a lot of things that, I think would also make it easier for Orthodoxy to grow if we are to kind of put some of the pieces back together regarding the diversity issues and some of the other cultural problems. And I do think a return to religion is possible. And despite the fact that the religion of America are restorationist cults that came about in these sort of great revivals and these great awakenings, there's nothing to say that there can't be an Orthodox Great Awakening in America. So I would not black pill. And connecting those questions together with the white person thing, you can't necessarily become an Orientalist. I love Greece. I'm a Bizaboo. I'm a Russia-boo, all these sorts of things. But we are ultimately, in some capacity, I don't want to say Western, but we are Anglo-Saxons. We are who we are. And I'm not even in favor of the Western Rite at all, or even anything like that. I just think there will be little T traditions regarding food, regarding music sung outside of a liturgical context, these sorts of things. Like, I love, go to Holy Cross Monastery. With some of the parishes in their area, they do these amazing concerts with these more Western or pre-schism even, Christmas hymns that, still very much have the Orthodox spirit, and they sing a lot of these. So I'd recommend looking those up. I think it's good, and I think more of that is ultimately going to come down the pipe.
No, that was an excellent answer, Conrad. Very in depth. And we thank you for being so frank, I think, because many of us, of course, have these deep thoughts about what is sort of the fate of America and how should Americans even view their own heritage. So I think that was very helpful. And the next question from Alexander: how exactly do prophecies work? Are they kind of predestined, but can be delayed based on the piety of the faithful? Or is it more general warnings about future events that aren't determined? Also, if you ever get a chance to do a full episode on King Arthur, that would be really cool. And I like that story since I was a kid. Thank you. I really enjoy y'all's work. God bless. God bless you too, Alexander. Great question about King Arthur. I think me and Conrad have spoken about this many times before, but absolutely we'll have a dedicated episode to that particular hero of Christian Western European history, I would say, and legend. A very folklorish in a way, but not far removed from maybe folklorish heroes in like Russian mythology, like Ilya Muromets, who turns out to be a saint, right? And Vladimir the Red Sun, right? Saint Vladimir who baptized Rus, etc. So there's some very interesting opinions about King Arthur that I think we can voice on the show. In particular, it is that interesting time period. He did exist and he did live in a period between, of course, Saint Constantine the Great and his presence in Britain, and of course the Roman Empire while it still existed on the island, and that sort of arrival of the Vikings and of course the creation of sort of the Roman Catholic domination and of course the schism. So it is that early English historical period that I think it's worth exploring. Definitely we'll do an episode. But in relation to the actual question at hand, prophecies, I would say, at least this is in my opinion based on my very deep readings, they are more than likely, there's a high probability that they will take place based on if the saints have clairvoyantly given us the will of God and sort of foreseeing the future. They've been shown a glimpse of what will happen in the future. There's a high probability that they will happen rather than not. I would say over 51% chance, right? So on the balance of probabilities, most likely, as opposed to our secular analysis, the prophecies are more accurate than even that. So that's how much weight I would give them. And of course, piety, as we know from literal Holy Scripture and church tradition, piety can, of course, call God and ask him for mercy, right? Mercy upon a particular nation. In particular, I think this relates to the previous question in regards to America, but in regards to Russia and Ukraine as well. So piety generally in a population can, of course, push certain dire warnings about the future and the general state of affairs back, especially if a nation is owed a sort of due of, shall we say, punishment or sobering up by God's divine providence. And Russia is a great example. Many saints foretold the revolution and the destruction of Russia that would take place. And many did not listen to those predictions because things looked like they were going so well in the early 1900s, just before the First World War, despite, of course, all the other tensions. People thought that perhaps simply putting their heads in the sand, not repenting, that would get them across the line. And that turned out to be, of course, a false understanding. So I would be, if there are prophecies and clairvoyant sayings of saints, which of course me and Conrad cover very deeply on the show. It's one of the reasons the show was even created in the first place in regards to the Third World War. We should definitely pay heed to them, and they matter more in my eyes, and they are more accurate than actual secular analysis that even me and Conrad can provide regarding geopolitical events and news stories that we read. So in fact, I would say, yes, we should definitely pay attention to them. And it's good to actually know them, right? You know them, they bring you into humility, repentance, and in fact, they should make you more Christian rather than take anything away from your faith. And that's how you know a prophecy is from God, if it brings you to repentance and brings you closer to God in the first place. And that's how you know the fruits are actually good. But of course, I would most likely just quote Matthew 10:16, the words of Christ himself, in regards to prophecies and the difficult times that may be ahead of us. And Christ told us, "Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Therefore be wise as serpents and harmless as doves." There are wolves, in fact, very much around us today, and we have to be wise as serpents, right? And still harmless as doves, humble, and to accept the things that may come to us, because in many ways we may not necessarily personally deserve them, but the hardships that may come upon us will most definitely, if we accept them as Orthodox Christians, they'll improve our faith and strengthen us. So we just have to be very courageous here.
I totally agree. And just to kind of tying that question in with the earlier question from Matthew, well, first of all, be sure to watch what Metropolitan Neophytos says about this. I think a fellow Aether Hour person talked about this in the thread, so I endorse what he said. I forget who said it, but check out the Uncreated Light Press from Metropolitan Neophytos, who his recent 4 talks about this, or the 4 videos from his recent talk about this, address this, as well as an older video. If you look up, I think if you just look up Changing Prophecies, Uncreated Light Press on YouTube, you'll find it. That's a really good explanation. But again, regarding, prophecies and, what's going to happen to America, look, there's nothing about what's going to happen to America. Look, things will be bad, but bad things will happen in the Levant. Bad things could easily happen in Russia. Bad things are happening right now in Ukraine. Bad things are happening right now in Palestine. So let's not act like we can't look and see what is going to happen. There are people there. There are people surviving. And if instead of sitting around worrying about what's going to happen to America, how about you build up an Orthodox village, increase your tithes to your parish, start to plan these sorts of things. And I think our audience in particular is equipped, intellectually and, with the spiritual resources of, very, serious Orthodox people in North America and the West. I think we are very equipped to deal with all of that. So, and Metropolitan Neophytos talks a lot about this stuff as well. So just listen to him at the end of the day. He's the one where we get all this stuff from. But Mike Lacey asks, what are the odds we've dodged a bullet concerning the eschatological prophecies of the contemporary Orthodox saints regarding war and current events? Will America still be torn apart, or was it already from 2020 to 2024? Had Trump not turned his head, America would be in a very different place spiritually and politically today. Look, y'all got to extend your time frame a little bit. First of all, we never say any dates on this show, but at the most basic level, when someone prophesies something and it doesn't happen within like 4 years, like that means nothing. I mean, like these sort of things can happen 20, 50, 100 years in the future. I mean, St. Cosmas of Aetolia prophesied things that didn't even happen till the end of the 20th century, and he existed in the 18th century. So these are, St. Seraphim of Sarov with the same sort of things. So we can't be hasty, but again, I think there will be natural disasters that hit America, and I do believe America will get into a hot war with Iran and probably China, and then the wild card is how Russia will be involved, of course, and then Turkey, obviously. But I think the next question becomes, will that war come home to America? Will there be bombing on American soil? Will something like, some force come up from the Mexican border? Will there be naval issues closer to America past Hawaii in the Pacific Ocean? These are all questions that are geopolitical and militaristic in nature that we can't necessarily give any kind of advice on right now, but I think it's still very likely. And even if that doesn't happen, I think in general America, we believe that just because God forgives you your sins doesn't mean that you necessarily don't reap certain consequences in this life. And even if America does have orthodoxy in its future and there will even be some sort of mass conversion, we've dug the hole pretty deep. The dirt's, it's something that's going to come back down on our heads in some capacity, and that might be, what we need. And I'm not saying that I'm an accelerationist, but let's not pretend that everybody doesn't understand that, things get worse before they get better, even in the eschatological sense. That's just basic Christian eschatology.
No, I think that's spot on, Conrad, and very accurate in regards to, of course, Mike Lacey's question as well as Alexander's. I think this sort of view of the future, I think, is the way we should approach it. And of course, Metropolitan Neophytos or more for his lectures, now that they're greatly subtitled, available still on YouTube, uncensored. They're a must watch in relation to all of these queries. Absolutely.
Thank you so much for listening to the free preview of this Aether Hour Q&A. Do not worry, everybody's questions obviously get answered behind the paywall. We talk about a whole host of issues, specifically our thoughts on the developing relations between Russia and Ukraine, the potential for Russia to get cleaved away from its allies Iran and China, and the sort of end game there, the future of what Russia will do regarding the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, how that will factor into negotiations. We also talk about potential reunion between the EP and the Pope. We discuss Putin, our thoughts on him as a man in a potential future episode on that issue. We also get into the future of World War Now, our thoughts on all of that, as well as some thoughts on how we think our audience can get engaged in their local communities. So don't hesitate to get behind the paywall and support the show, worldwarnow.co. Obviously, if you get behind the paywall, you can not only ask a question in the future Q&A, but you get access to all of the hundreds and hundreds of hours of our previous Aether Hour episodes, and of course, get the satisfaction of knowing that your contribution is what's keeping the lights on here at the proverbial World War Now, World War III bunker. So thank you all so much for listening, and we will see you on the other side. God bless.